There comes a moment when you're simply exhausted, not because you're lazy nor because you've given up, but because you've put your everything in for so long and nothing seems to shift. You keep showing up, doing all the right things, going above and beyond, yet somehow everything still feels stuck. You question yourself, your path, wondering if maybe something is broken, maybe it's you. But what if it's not? What if the real problem isn't that you haven't tried hard enough, but that you've been conditioned to believe effort is the answer, while trust, real grounded trust, has been seen as weakness? The Stoics taught that peace doesn't come from trying to control everything, but by aligning ourselves with life's natural rhythm. Marcus Aurelius didn't force the world to bend. He bent his mind to meet it. And perhaps that's the shift we need. Less pushing, more flowing. Less panic, more presence. Because the truth is, the more you trust, the less effort you'll need to exert. Not because you've stopped caring, but because you stop wasting energy on what was never yours to carry. And I promise, there's a kind of strength that only reveals itself when you stop chasing and start listening. If something inside you feels understood right now, if this message is helping you breathe a little deeper, there's one small favor I'll ask. Hit that subscribe button. It shows me you're ready to stop performing and start transforming. Let's continue walking this path of clarity, calm, and quiet power together. Do you know why it hurts so much when things stay still despite your best effort? It's not just the stagnation. It's what we interpret that stillness to mean. We've been taught over and over that effort is our currency, that the more we give, the more we're worth. So when you give your all, stretch yourself thin, and life doesn't respond, it feels personal. As if the silence is a reflection of your value, not your strategy, timing, or alignment, just you. But that's a dangerous lie. One many of us swallowed without question. Somewhere along the way, we confused motion with meaning, as if staying busy could protect us from disappointment. But what if the real issue has never been your discipline, your hustle, or your sacrifice? What if the problem is that you've been trained to trust only in what you can control? Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." And that's what we do. We unconsciously grip every task, every deadline, every relationship, thinking that if we just try hard enough, nothing will fall apart. But this constant striving, it's not strength, it's survival. And survival has no room for trust. It only knows how to tighten, to perform, to cling. Trust, in contrast, is about letting go, and letting go is terrifying when control has become your comfort. But here's what no one teaches us. Trust isn't passive. It's not a shrug or a surrender. Trust is active. It requires clarity. It requires courage. It asks you to step back, breathe deeper, and say, "I don't know how this will work out, but I no longer need to force it to." That's not weakness. That's a strength most people never access. Socrates believed, "The unexamined life is not worth living." And if you take an honest look at your patterns, the urgency, the over-explaining, the constant exhaustion, you might realize you've been living inside a loop that tells you your worth is only as valuable as your output. That unless you're tired, you haven't tried hard enough. But exhaustion isn't a badge of honor. It's often a sign you're leaking energy into things you were never meant to carry. And effort without alignment turns into suffering. You can sprint full speed and still feel lost. That's why trust matters. Trust puts you back on the path, not by speeding things up, but by reconnecting you to what matters. Aristotle once said, "Knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom, and trust starts with knowing who you are." When there's nothing to prove, who are you without the striving? Without the constant need to earn your place, who are you when you're not micromanaging every outcome? Most people never find out because silence feels uncomfortable, space feels threatening, and stillness feels like failure. But stillness, that's where recalibration happens. That's where insight resides. Plato taught, A life without balance is a life without harmony, and balance doesn't come from doing more. It comes from doing less, but with greater intention. When you stop living on autopilot, when you stop forcing things just to feel safe, you start noticing something else. Life begins to speak in quiet nudges, in unexpected peace, in moments you didn't plan, but somehow feel just right. That's trust. And the more you lean into it, the more you realize you were never meant to chase everything. You were meant to recognize what's already yours. There's power in releasing what doesn't respond to your presence. There's clarity in walking away from the things that only thrive on your anxiety. And no, it won't always be easy. You'll be tempted to go back to fix, to prove, to push. But every time you choose stillness over panic, you reclaim your energy. Every time you choose clarity over chaos, you return to yourself. This is the real work, not grinding yourself into dust for temporary progress, but learning to trust that what's aligned doesn't need to be forced. When you stop measuring your worth by productivity, something else shows up. Peace. Not the peace that comes from nothing happening, but the peace that comes from knowing you no longer need to force life into shape. You're shaping it by trusting it. And that's the beginning of a very different kind of power. Most people think trust means waiting around doing nothing, like sitting on the sidelines hoping life will toss you a bone. But real trust, it's not passive. It's power in motion. It's not the absence of action. It's the presence of alignment, a quiet kind of strength that doesn't shout or scramble. Trust is a way of moving through life without needing to wrestle it into shape, without constantly bracing for impact or chasing what already belongs to you. You don't need to force people to stay. That version of love, the one that makes you shrink yourself just to be chosen, isn't love. It's fear disguised as effort. You don't need to chase timing either. What's meant for you will arrive when you're ready, not when you're anxious. And you definitely don't need to micromanage every outcome just to feel secure. Control might give you the illusion of safety, but it robs you of peace. When you trust, you stop sprinting into the future, trying to fix what hasn't even happened yet. You stop rehearsing every scenario, crafting backup plans to backup plans. Instead, you come back to the only place you've ever had power, this moment right here, where your breath is right here, where your intuition whispers truth if you're still enough to hear it. Plato once said, "The first and best victory is to conquer yourself," and that's what trust really is. It's the internal win, the moment you realize you don't need external control to feel steady inside. It's letting go of the compulsion to react, to fix, to perform, and replacing it with presence, with knowing. So ask yourself this: what if the next breakthrough isn't about trying harder, but finally allowing? What if the answer isn't hiding in more effort, more strategy, more stress, but in less resistance? We're so used to working for everything that the idea of receiving feels foreign, even suspicious. But not everything valuable comes through struggle. Carl Jung said, "What you resist persists." And many of us are resisting the very clarity we crave by refusing to slow down, to trust the unfolding. Allowing doesn't mean sitting back and watching your life drift by. It means no longer pushing against the current when the river already knows the way. It means acting when it's time and resting when it's not. It means knowing when to speak and when silence will speak louder. This is the rhythm of trust. It doesn't abandon motion. It just rejects the frenzy. When you finally stop trying to bend life to your timeline, you begin to notice something strange. Things start happening with less friction. People show up without needing to be chased. Opportunities open without being forced. Even your body relaxes because it no longer thinks it has to hold everything together. Aristotle believed, "Nature does nothing in vain," which means the pauses, the delays, the detours, they aren't voids, they're part of the pattern. But if you're too busy rushing, you'll call them failures. If you don't trust the process, you'll keep mislabeling growth as stagnation, healing as weakness, stillness as being stuck. But when you learn to allow, you reclaim your energy. You stop scattering your presence across 100 imagined futures and come back to what is. You begin to move, not from panic, but from purpose. You act not to prove, but because you are aligned. And that shift? That's what turns effort into impact. That's what transforms chaos into clarity. Socrates once warned, "Beware the barrenness of a busy life." He understood what many of us are still trying to grasp. Activity isn't the same as effectiveness. Movement doesn't always mean meaning. And trying harder without direction only exhausts the soul. So maybe the next time you feel like doubling down, like fixing something that isn't broken, like chasing validation or forcing a door open, pause, breathe. Ask yourself, what if this isn't about doing more? What if this is my moment to trust more? Because that subtle shift from force to faith, from control to surrender, is where your real power begins. Not in how much you can carry, but in how much you're willing to let go. Why do we try so hard to prove something that's already true? Why do we spend so much of our lives exhausting ourselves in search of a validation we already deserve? Somewhere along the way, we've been conditioned to believe that who we are isn't enough, unless we polish it, package it, and present it for approval. Raw presence must always be backed by performance, so we explain ourselves even when no one's asking. We analyze every detail of our day until our minds are worn thin. We keep showing up long after our spirit has checked out, not because we want to, but because we're afraid not to. There's a difference between effort and fear, and most of us are running on fear, calling it commitment. We say yes when our bodies scream no. We keep our schedules full because empty space feels unsafe. Rest starts to look like weakness. Stillness starts to feel like failure. And slowing down becomes the biggest risk of all. Because what happens if we stop running? What if everything we've been holding together just falls apart? Carl Jung once said, "A man who has not passed through the inferno of his passions has never overcome them." And maybe that's part of it. Maybe all this proving, all this noise, is an attempt to outrun our own fire, an attempt to avoid the silence that might expose the truth we've buried under our productivity. The truth that we never believed we were enough to begin with. But here's what changes everything. What's meant for you doesn't need to be chased. You don't need to convince it. You don't need to wear yourself out to earn it. You just need to be still enough to recognize it. And recognition requires presence, not performance. Think about that for a moment. Recognition is an act of awareness. It's not about effort. It's about clarity. And clarity doesn't come when you're tangled in anxiety, trying to manage every moving part of your life like it's a crisis waiting to happen. Clarity arrives when you stop trying to impress and start being honest, when you stop bracing for disappointment and start leaning into trust. Aristotle believed that knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom. But how can we truly know ourselves when we're constantly bending to meet expectations that aren't even ours? When we're so busy becoming what we think we need to be, we forget what we actually are. This is the trap, mistaking fear for discipline, effort for worth, movement for progress. But there's a moment, subtle and quiet, where something shifts. You start to see the difference between what you've been chasing and what's been quietly waiting for you to slow down. Not to stop, but to become aware, to notice the signs, to recognize the alignment. And you can't do that when you're stuck in the cycle of proving. Plato once said, "The beginning is the most important part of the work." But beginning again, beginning from truth instead of fear, that requires more courage than all the chasing in the world. Because now, the work isn't about earning something outside of you, it's about reclaiming what was already inside. And here's the hard part, you will be tempted to go back, to explain yourself, to try harder, to be louder. But each time you choose stillness over desperation, each time you say no from self-respect instead of yes from fear, you reclaim something vital, your alignment. Socrates said, "To find yourself, think for yourself." And thinking for yourself, feeling for yourself, living for yourself. That's what trust makes possible. Not just trust in life, but trust in your own enoughness. Trust that you're not falling behind. Trust that rest doesn't mean you've quit. Trust that what's real will always know how to find you, without the theatrics, without the burnout, without the chase. Because the moment you stop trying to prove you're worthy is the moment you realize you already are. Trying is noisy. It clutters the mind, fills the calendar, and floods the nervous system with urgency. It's a constant hum in the background, always reaching, always adjusting, always proving. You can feel it in your shoulders, in your jaw, in that restless part of your mind that refuses to settle. It's the inner narrative whispering that unless you're fixing something, you're falling behind. Trying demands attention. It wants to be seen. It wants results. It operates from a place of lack. Because if you truly felt whole, would you be pushing this hard to fill the silence? Trust, on the other hand, is quiet. It doesn't need an audience. It doesn't need a finish line to feel fulfilled. Trust just is. It lives in the subtle, in the pause between thoughts, in the exhale after a long day, in the decision not to force what doesn't feel right. Trust isn't passive, it's presence. It's the ability to hold stillness without interpreting it as failure. And ironically, the moment you stop grasping, the very things you were chasing start to arrive. Not because you went after them harder, but because you finally became still enough to receive. Carl Jung once wrote, "What you resist not only persists, but will grow in size." So much of what we label as effort is actually resistance in disguise, resistance to uncertainty, resistance to slowing down, resistance to not knowing. But that resistance, however dressed up as ambition, creates tension. And tension blocks clarity. It blinds you to what's already unfolding right in front of you. Think about it. How many poor choices have come from that fear of waiting too long? How many jobs, relationships, conversations or commitments have you jumped into just to escape the discomfort of patience? And how often did you end up right back in chaos, telling yourself it was progress, when deep down, it was just motion? Silence scares people, not because it's dangerous, but because it reveals. It reveals all the internal noise we've been avoiding with productivity. It holds up a mirror to the parts of us that are still learning how to be okay without external proof. But trust teaches you that silence isn't empty, it's sacred. It's where life starts to breathe on its own again. It's the space where intuition speaks louder than fear, where guidance doesn't scream, it whispers. Plato once said, "The greatest wealth is to live content with little." And that kind of contentment, the inner stillness that doesn't crave constant stimulation, isn't found through grasping. It's found in letting go of the belief that urgency equals importance. It's found in stepping back, even when every fear says step forward. Trust allows you to make decisions from clarity instead of pressure. It creates room to feel before acting, to listen before speaking, to align before moving. And that space, that's where you start to see the difference between what's truly meant for you and what you've been conditioned to chase. Trying may get you there faster, but trust ensures that when you arrive, you're not empty, that you haven't lost your peace, your center, or your sense of self in the process. Socrates said, "Beware the barrenness of a busy life." And if you've ever gotten everything you wanted only to feel more anxious than ever, you understand what he meant. In a world obsessed with speed, trust is a rebellion. It's a radical return to inner wisdom, a gentle refusal to panic, and a powerful reminder that not everything of value needs to be chased. Some things, especially the most meaningful, come not through force, but through readiness. And sometimes readiness looks like doing less, not because you've given up, but because you've finally learned how to receive. If you've spent years believing that pain is the cost of progress, then trust will feel dangerous. It won't feel like freedom. It will feel like failure. Because when you're used to equating worth with struggle, anything that doesn't hurt enough starts to feel suspicious. Letting go, even just a little, feels like slipping, like falling behind. But the truth is, you've been climbing a mountain that might not even be yours to climb, and that's where it gets difficult. Because for so long, suffering became part of your identity. You've tied your sense of self to the hustle, wrapped your value around how much discomfort you can tolerate. Somewhere along the way, you started believing that burnout was discipline, that the more exhausted you were, the more committed you must be, that if you're constantly anxious, always wired, always on edge, you must be on the right path. But what if all that tension isn't a sign you're progressing? What if it's a sign you're out of alignment? Carl Jung once wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." For many of us, that unconscious belief that you must suffer to succeed is quietly guiding the way. It makes rest seem lazy. It makes ease seem unearned. It convinces you that unless you're proving something, you're not enough. But what if the life you desire doesn't exist in effort? What if it lives in alignment? What if it's not about grinding until you collapse, but about choosing what resonates with who you truly are, deeply and authentically, without forcing anything into place? That shift from effort to alignment is subtle, but it changes everything. Because alignment doesn't ask you to neglect responsibility. It asks you to stop neglecting yourself. It doesn't mean you stop showing up. It means you stop showing up from a place of desperation. When you move from alignment, your actions still matter, but they're no longer soaked in panic. They're rooted in clarity. Aristotle believed that pleasure in the job puts perfection in the work, and it's true. When you're aligned, work still requires effort, but it doesn't feel like suffering. There's rhythm, there's purpose, there's breath. You're not dragging yourself through each day, hoping you'll finally feel worthy when you reach the finish line. You feel it now as you walk. But here's the catch. Letting go of suffering means letting go of the story that made you feel valuable through it. And that can feel like losing yourself, because who are you if you're not proving something? Who are you without the pressure? You're someone who's beginning again, not from lack, but from wisdom. Someone who finally understands that peace isn't the absence of effort. It's the absence of self-betrayal. Someone who's realized that your body wasn't made to be at war with itself, that your mind wasn't meant to exist in a constant state of fight or flight, that your spirit wasn't born to survive every day, it was born to live. Socrates said, "The secret of change is to focus all of your energy, not on fighting the old, but on building the new." That's what alignment offers, not a rejection of growth, but a redirection away from punishment and toward possibility. You begin to build not from fear, but from faith. Not because you're trying to escape something, but because you're moving towards something real. Letting go will still feel wrong some days. You'll still feel the urge to overdo, overthink, overcompensate, but with time, trust becomes easier. Your nervous system softens. Your inner dialogue becomes kinder. You stop confusing chaos with progress, and what once felt unfamiliar, ease, rest, flow, starts to feel like home. And when that happens, the world around you starts to shift too. Not because you pushed harder, but because you stopped pushing against all the wrong things and started listening to the right ones. You weren't made to clench your jaw through every decision, that tightness in your chest, the tension in your shoulders. It's not a badge of honor. It's a sign you've been carrying life too rigidly, too fearfully. Somewhere along the way, you learned that pressure equals progress, that if something doesn't feel heavy, it must not be working. But that mindset turns life into a constant emergency. You begin walking on edge, not out of passion, but out of survival. And that's not what you were built for. You weren't meant to be in a perpetual state of bracing. You weren't designed to second-guess every step, hoping that anxiety could somehow predict the future. There's another way, a way most people forget exists, where decisions don't rise from panic, but from presence. A way of moving that starts with grounded clarity, not with the fear of being left behind. Plato said, "Better a little which is well done than a great deal imperfectly." But we live in a world that rewards speed, not depth. We rush because we think stillness is risky, that if we're not leaping, we're falling behind. But the truth is, some of the worst decisions are made when we're just trying to escape the quiet. We run not because the path is clear, but because the stillness makes us uncomfortable. Stillness, though, isn't absence. It's information. It's where the deeper answers live. When you stop scrambling to force the next step, you begin to feel when something genuinely calls you forward. Not out of desperation, not out of fear, but from something far more powerful, alignment. Carl Jung once observed, "Your vision will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakens." And that's what happens. You wake up, not to some dramatic new version of yourself, but to the version that's been there all along. The version that doesn't need to perform, panic, or perfect things to feel worthy. The version that knows you're already whole, already enough. This is trust. It's not about blind hope or pretending everything is fine. It's about coming home to yourself. Learning to feel discomfort without trying to fix it right away. Allowing hard moments to pass without rushing to control them. Trust doesn't ask you to be passive. It asks you to be present. It asks you to stop running and start listening. Aristotle believed that knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom, and trust is part of that knowing. It's the choice to stop outsourcing your value, to stop chasing approval, to stop trying to manage every outcome. Because when you truly trust, you no longer need to hold everything together to feel safe. You begin to understand that nothing real will ever require you to betray yourself to keep it. You don't lose your ambition. You just stop confusing effort with worth. You don't lose your drive. You just stop letting fear drive it. What you gain is a deeper kind of strength, one that doesn't shout but stands firm, one that doesn't need to be seen to feel secure. Socrates said, "To find yourself, think for yourself." And when you trust yourself, you finally give yourself permission to think, feel, and act from truth. Not habit, not fear, not someone else's expectations. That's when life starts to feel different, not always easier, but clearer, more grounded, more real. You stop trying to be everything for everyone. You stop stretching yourself thin to prove you can handle it all. And in that stopping, in that stillness, you remember who you are, not the version molded by pressure, but the one shaped by peace, the one that doesn't need to earn love, success, or belonging, because you already belong, you already are. And that's what trust brings you back to every single time. You don't need to become anything else to be worthy. You just need to remember who you were before the world convinced you to prove it. That's the quiet power of trust. It returns you to yourself.